Trump's asked the U.S. for a ceasefire. The president adding he will consider it only after the Strait of Hormuz.
What's up? What's up? What's up? And Trump will be addressing the nation tonight. So what we're going to do today is we're going to see how the market is going to react to all this. We're going to see how the stock market is going to react. All these talks, you know, Trump saying that the Iranian leader, the new president over there, the new guy that's running things, Ayatollah's son, is wanting to make a deal. So we're going to see how the market is going to react. We're going to go back and forth. We're going to do that, and we're also going to react to what Trump is saying right now. So we're doing multiple things at one time. Appreciate y'all for joining me. I'm your host, the one and only Stock Sniper. Hold up, I gotta go. Hold on a second, chat. I gotta go get something. Yeah, I gotta go get something. All right, I'm back. So I think we're going to watch a little bit of the stock market first. We're going to go back and forth. See what's going on. See, if you was watching yesterday on the S&P 500, we were waiting for it to go over. Let me put it on the 30-minute. See, as we can see, yesterday I was talking about the 650 area. Well, we broke through that. Big W-shaped pattern. We broke through that. So that area is crossed, so we got to find the next area. But what's very important is what Trump is going to say tonight. He has said he's going to talk to the nation tonight. So the plan I was talking about yesterday, we're going to have to back off because there ain't no telling what he's going to say. If you look over here to the left, the whole market is green because everybody's anticipating that he's going to say what he's going to say tonight. Everybody's anticipating that he's going to give us good news tonight. So let me see. Let me go over here. What am I trying to do? Okay, I'm trying to set this up. Shoot. Hold up. I got to set this up too. I'm forgetting to do a lot of things. Hold on, chat. Matter of fact, while I'm doing that, I'm going to take it off this. We're going to hold on, chat.
That's certainly reflected in the polls, which gives him a low approval rating and a very low approval rating for this war. And so they're trying to break through to get to the American people and say, look, in the long term, this is a good thing. We have done this to Iran. We have severely limited what they are able to do to the rest of the world and to their neighbours. We have severely limited their nuclear program. This is something that we're hugely successful at. We're working in the right direction, and it is only just a few more weeks. Now, Donald Trump has just left here. He's left the White House. He's heading to the Supreme Court, where there's a hearing today about birthright citizenship, another political battle that Donald Trump is fighting. He believes his presence might help his side argue their case. Of course, he's been very critical of the justices on the Supreme Court, many of whom he appointed simply because they went against his tariff policy, which was announced 1 year ago tomorrow. What is interesting is he refused to make any announcement on April the 1st because he felt people would regard it as an April Fool. A couple of people have texted me in the last hour saying, is the announcement of Iran looking for a ceasefire actually an April Fool as well?
Right, okay. All right, Alan. Well, who knows? Alan Fisher there at the White House in Washington, D.C. Let's cross from the U.S. capital to Tehran now to Ali Hashem. So, Ali, President Donald Trump saying Iran has asked for a ceasefire. What's being said there?
Well, according to Iranian officials, they're denying completely this request for a ceasefire. The only thing that comes to mind is President Pezeshkian's call today with the head of the European Council, President of the European Council, where he said, we have the necessary resolve to bring this war to an end while observing its requirements, especially the essential guarantees to prevent the recurrence of aggression. This is the only thing close to what might be an idea of ending the war. But of course, it's not a request of ceasefire, and it emphasizes on the idea of ending the war with guarantees that it's not going to occur once again. So it's completely different from what President Trump has been tweeting or, posting on Truth Social. So Iranian officials are denying this completely. And we heard yesterday the foreign minister, he's the man in charge of the diplomacy in this country, saying that they're not looking for a ceasefire. They want a comprehensive end of this war. And actually, all the analysis here in Iran and the observations and officials are saying that they are not in a position to ask for a ceasefire, because this is going to be very harmful for Iran, because it's going to leave this whole conflict in this just flying the sky in tatters. At any time, they might be attacked once again. What they want is, just like Mr. Pezeshkian said, the President Pezeshkian, that they need guarantees so that this is not going to happen again. Also, Abbas Araghchi yesterday in a phone call with the Lebanese speaker, Nabi Birri, said that the end of the war in Iran is going to be in accordance with the end of the war in Lebanon. I mean, it's very complicated to end this way.
Ali, thanks for that. Ali Hashem there in Tehran. So let's explore this further with Mohammed Al-Masri, who's here on set with us. He's a professor of media studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Mohammed, great to have you with us. So Donald Trump saying Iran has asked for a ceasefire. He went on to say in his Truth Social post that Washington will consider it when Hormuz Strait is open, free and clear. Until then, US forces are blasting Iran into oblivion, or as they say, back into the Stone Ages. So first up, the first element of that, that Iran has asked for a ceasefire. How do you read that?
Well, it's difficult to know. I think there are a lot of people watching, observing, that are trying to be hopeful, right? I think almost everybody wants this war to end. I've been saying for a month that no one really benefits from this war except Israel, which pushed for the war. So I think we're all trying to read into it something optimistic, but we have to be cautious. The Iranians are denying it, as your correspondent Ali was just saying. And this is also coming from Donald Trump. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that Donald Trump has a long history of saying things that are not true, right? In 2021, I think this is relevant, the Washington Post did an analysis of Trump's political discourse during his first term, his first four-year term. And they found 30,000 plus statements that he had made that were either completely false or misleading. Just in the context of the current conflagration, very early on, Donald Trump was saying that the Iranians were communicating.
Yeah, Critical 509. Yeah, one side, Trump is saying that they are in negotiations. Trump is going to address the nation tonight. And the other side, even the people on the other side, are saying that they're not in negotiations with Trump.
With him or with the White House, with the Washington, and basically begging him, begging the Americans for a ceasefire. Dropsite News did some investigative reporting, and what they found is that it was the Americans who were reaching out via Steve Witkoff on WhatsApp, messaging the Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi. He was messaging Araghchi asking to talk, asking to negotiate, and Araghchi didn't even respond to the messages. So this is a long way of saying that we have to be very cautious
Right,
about.
that gives it very good context, Mohammed. Now, he goes on to say that Washington will consider the potential for a ceasefire when Hormuz Strait is open, free and clear. Until then, US forces are blasting Iran into oblivion. So any optimism that we're all desperately looking for to see an end to this war, well, that shatters it, doesn't it? Because it would suggest that he plans to plow on.
Yeah, I mean, he's sort of giving people hope in one breath and then kind of taking it away in the next. But the language that he's using is also important, right? Yesterday,
back to the Stone Ages.
Yeah, yesterday I was just going to say, he said he wants to bomb Iran back into the Stone Age, and now he's using this forceful language, bomb them into oblivion. This is not exactly encouraging, particularly when you consider the context that Israel and the United States have already hit hundreds of schools and hospitals and thousands of residential homes, that they are using 2,000-pound bombs to take out entire city blocks. So this is not exactly a careful, precision operation. They are knocking out a lot of civilian infrastructure. And historically, Israel is known for this. They're known for punishing civilians and civilian areas. This is part of their military doctrine, right? They do it in Lebanon, they do it in Gaza. And so we shouldn't be surprised to see it in Iran. Yesterday, Trump said that he anticipates the war wrapping up in 2 to 3 weeks. Historically, right before a ceasefire, before a war ends, Israel actually intensifies their attacks. They've done this in Lebanon, they've done this in the Palestinian territories. So we should be, I think, very concerned about the possibility that the Americans and the Israelis will actually, sort of intensify their attacks in the coming days and perhaps weeks.
It seems pretty evident that whatever happens, there will still be fundamental issues at stake here in the region, particularly around the Strait of Hormuz.
I think so. I mean, on pretty much every measure, things are worse now than they were, 31 or 32 days ago before this all started. We're looking now at an Iran that is probably going to be more hardened, right? I mean, the U.S. is already acknowledging through Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, even Trump implicitly, that this regime is not going anywhere, that they are going to continue to exist. They're going to be standing when this is all done. And I think there's real fear now that the Iranians will actually try to get a nuclear weapon sooner than later, because it's likely that they're calculating that the only way to truly guarantee that this doesn't happen again in a year or 2 or 3 is to have a nuclear deterrent. And so there's actually, in some ways, more fear of instability and violence now than there was 31 or 32 days ago. And that's to say nothing of the enormous economic cost, which I think globally we will be feeling for many months, and I'm afraid, according to some economists, years perhaps.
Okay, we'll leave it there, Mohammed. Thanks very much for that. Mohammed al-Masri, speak to you later. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, there have been more Israeli strikes on villages in southern Lebanon. Israeli forces are expanding their attacks in the region as they continue to occupy the area. Israel's defense minister has said all houses in the villages near the border in Lebanon will be destroyed, quote, in accordance with the model of Rafah and Beit Hanun in Gaza. Zena Hodder has this now from Beirut.
Israeli forces have invaded southern Lebanon, and Defense Minister Israel Katz says they won't leave, even after the current war with Hezbollah has ended. And while Israel's army says it is not operating against UN peacekeepers, the Lebanese military, or civilians, it has targeted an army position, killed many civilians, and called on UN forces to avoid combat zones that residents were told to leave. The mandate of the UN interim force in Lebanon, or UNIFIL, ends this year after decades, largely due to Israeli pressure.
The Israel Defense Forces are in control of substantial areas immediately north of the Blue Line. The civilian suffering from the hostilities continues to mount. UNIFIL on the ground carrying out its mission given by this council, has now also suffered fatalities.
The UN is still investigating the incidents, but it says the situation in Lebanon has dangerously deteriorated with the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel has been trying to empty the area south of the Litani, and Lebanese officials are denouncing Israel's new occupation of the area.
We call upon this council to act immediately and to condemn these statements clearly and explicitly, and to take the necessary measures to compel Israel to halt its incursions and withdraw its forces to internationally recognized
Market
borders.
is not even really moving.
Israel occupied southern Lebanon for 18 years before withdrawing in 2000.
Not really moving.
Israel's offensive against Hezbollah has no front line. Israel's airstrikes have again targeted the Lebanese capital. In a letter to the UN Security Council, the government in Beirut asked the international community to secure a clear commitment from Israel to stop all attacks across the country.
Israel says it won't stop, and it is also refusing the Lebanese government's offer to hold direct negotiations. It wants Hezbollah to disarm and is pressuring the state to enforce its decision to ban the group's military wing. The army is reluctant to do so in a time of war, with the defense minister warning Israel's plans are, quote, a deepening of its aggression against Lebanon. Zana Khuder, Al Jazeera, Beirut.
The army has issued forced displacement orders for people in southern Lebanon. This is the Israeli army to head north of the Zahrani River. It's about 40 kilometers from the Israeli border. It means the evacuation zone now extends beyond the Litani to the Zahrani River. And that's about 14% of Lebanon's territory, and it affects more than 100 towns and villages. Najat Siliba is an independent member of the Lebanese parliament, and she says she supports the government's call for Hezbollah to disarm.
The cabinet has clearly said that there is no cover-up for any military action that Hezbollah is doing. Hezbollah chose to push Lebanon into this war. We could have been on the side, just looking at what's happening regionally without really being in the middle of this whole mess. So we stand by the government and by the decisions of the government to ask Hezbollah to turn its weapons all to the Lebanese armed forces, so that the call for peace and the call for war would be only in the hands of the government, including the Lebanese armed forces. If they want to work within the Lebanese government and under the law as a political party, the cabinet has been clear on this stand, as well as the president. Of course, all parties in Lebanon can work under the same law equally and with equity to actually allow political work. But to allow military work, this should not be the case in any of the countries that we have seen in the world. There is no possibility to have two armies, two military actions, or a militia and a local and national force working opposite to each other in order for peace to be held. There is no way we can have peace if the militia of Iran is going to continue to work on its own as Iran pleases and not the Lebanese people.
South Africa has announced it will cut fuel taxes for the month of April to help consumers cope with rising prices. The move follows pressure from trade unions and business groups urging the government to intervene and to soften the impact of the Iran war. Petrol prices are forecast to rise by around 15%, and diesel could increase by 40%. Australia's Prime Minister has called on citizens to play their part in conserving fuel. Prices have surged, and there are shortages in some areas due to the war in Iran and the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. The country imports about 90% of its fuel.
Now, it's the Australian way that people want to do their bit. And there are simple ways that you can. You should go about your business and your life as normal. Enjoy your Easter. And if you're hitting the road, don't take more fuel than you need. Just fill up like you normally would. Think of others in your community, in the bush, and in critical industries. And over coming weeks, if you can switch to catching the train or bus or tram to work, do so. That builds our reserves and it saves fuel for people who have no choice but to drive. Farmers and miners and tradies who need diesel every single day. And all those shift workers and nurses who do so much for our country.
Let's hear now from Danielle Robertson, who reports from Sydney.
Sam Alkosh started his own trucking company more than 2 decades ago, loading up at warehouses and delivering groceries across the country. He's travelled more than 24 million kilometres. He's enough to wrap around the earth 600 times. But he fears he could soon be forced off the road.
With the fuel prices goes up, yep, we will have to park the truck on the fence and just sit at home because we can't afford it to run trucks on the road with this fuel price.
Truck drivers are responsible for 80% of all freight, so any disruption threatens the entire supply chain.
Without trucks, Australians stop because everything run by transport. Anything you want by transport, even like the household, everything.
Warnings now that food security could be at risk if drivers struggle to deliver to supermarkets. That pressure already felt by the public as hundreds of petrol stations run dry.
I'm just conscious of driving less and not driving around as long as a conscious decision just not to do that. So yeah, just feeling for everybody, even just going to the grocery stores, things are getting more expensive.
Definitely a scary place to be for a young person trying to get forward paying bills.
After mounting pressure and a second emergency meeting, the government has announced it will halve the fuel excise, meaning the cost of petrol and diesel will drop by more than 18 cents a litre for 3 months. A move part of a 4-point plan that will cost the budget more than $1.7 billion, steering clear from fuel rationing for now, instead looking to other countries to help secure supplies.
This month, 6 oil shipments that were due to arrive here from Malaysia, Singapore and South Korea were cancelled or delayed as countries begin to prioritise their own fuel supply over exports. In response, the government struck a deal with Singapore, signing a joint statement to ensure the flow of critical supplies.
Australia looking to its allies in Asia to keep the nation moving. Danielle Robertson, Al Jazeera, Sydney.
Just a quick recap of the breaking news from the United States. And President Trump says Iran has asked for a ceasefire. In a social media post, he said Washington will consider when the Hormuz Strait is open, free and clear. Until then, US forces are blasting Iran into oblivion, or as they say, back to the Stone Ages. More on this at the top of the hour. I'll be back a little bit later. Bye for now.
See, that's what I say, Chad. On the other side, Iran is saying that there is no peace talk. And let me go over here. I'm watching this very closely. And let me go here. The markets are basically sideways. See, when Trump came out with that tweet, before the markets opened, we had this big uptick, but then Iran turned around and said, there are no negotiations. And we dropped back down, and now we just basically moving sideways. See, like what I was talking about yesterday, my area for a short was 650 by today. Well, we're over 650 now. You know, we over 650. So my next area, I'm gonna leave that right there, is right here for tomorrow. Because Iran is still saying that there is no deal. So by them saying that, that shows uncertainty. And we don't know what's going to happen. Tomorrow is Thursday. Well, Friday is a holiday. So Friday is just like another weekend. It's just a part of the weekend. So we don't know what's going to happen Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So with Iran saying the direct opposite of what Trump is saying. That's not good. So it's not good. So I moved my entry from 650 up to this area of resistance up here, which is 660. So now we just move it on up to the next area of resistance, which is right here. This area right here is the next area of resistance of what we had pullbacks, pull back. But it's what Trump says tonight. I don't think, with Iran not agreeing with him, I don't think it makes that much of a difference. But if Iran would have said, well, yeah, we are in talks, we are in negotiations to end this thing, then it would be a hell of a lot better. But since, nobody's agreeing, one side saying this, the other side saying something totally different, that's a lot of uncertainty. And the market don't like that. That's why we're sideways right now. So let's go back over here and see what else they're going to talk about. Let me get off of here. Dang. So when I do that, it takes it back off. Let's see. No, we good. We good. Okay.
Fuel prices and all the things that has knock-on effects to. But he believes that it's just a short-term pain for the long-term gain of a no nuclear Iran. And so he is pushing that idea, and he'll do it in prime time. But whether or not there is actually a ceasefire on the table, Donald Trump says there is. We have to take the president at face value. And he says in that tweet, that in that message on Truth Social, that until the Strait of Hormuz is open, free and clear, they will continue blasting Iran into oblivion, which is certainly a huge flag to suggest that he's not about to announce the end of the war in about 11 hours' time.
Alan, stay there. We're going to come back to you, but let's go to Ali Hashim in Tehran. Where is the Iranian leadership response here? You've been speaking to people. They've poured scorn over this?
Well, yeah, we spoke to an official, and he said clearly that Iran denies that they've asked for, requested any ceasefire. And the only thing that comes to mind is President Masoud Pezeshkian's stances today while speaking to the chairman of the European Council, when he said that Iran, let me just read from the accurate line, that Iran is ready to end the war with resolve. However, this should happen by meeting the guarantees that this is not going to recur once again. And this is the official line that's been said over the past weeks. And we had yesterday Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister of Iran, speaking to Tehran bureau chief, Al Jazeera's Tehran bureau chief, telling him that Iran is not looking for a ceasefire, it's looking for an end of this war. And they've been repeating this several times, and they've also repeated that they're ready for a long war of attrition, a war that is at least 6 months, and they want all the other fronts to end together. So they have their own long list of requests before reaching a ceasefire. Actually, a ceasefire from an Iranian point of view doesn't serve Iran, because it opens the chance for the freedom of action for Israel and the United States, and this can be repeated anytime. What the Iranians want is an end, and a complete end with finishing, let me say, finalizing all the files, the nuclear file, the sanctions, and getting back to the normal situation of a state that doesn't have to go through all what it went through. Also, this is not only Iran's issue. There's another issue we have to take into consideration. Regional stability. If this is not going to end with a clear picture, with a clear agreement, how are the countries in the region going to deal with the new situation? What's going to be the fate of the Strait of Hormuz? We know the situation right now, it's closed. So there are many issues on this list, and it cannot end this simply.
Now, that's Ali Hashem. Stay there. He's live for us in Tehran. We're going to go to Alan Fisher, who's in the White House for us. Now, Donald Trump has been talking up all the prospects of the war ending in 2 to 3 weeks. But he's also said, deal or not, it's irrelevant. And now he's going to make this primetime address. You talked about it earlier. This primetime address, this has to be the beginning of the end of the war, do we think?
Well, look, there's a couple of things to point out. Donald Trump will claim victory. That was always going to be on the cards. He's going to point to the military successes that the United States have had, and there have been successes. They've effectively destroyed the Iranian Navy, they've destroyed the Air Force, they have military superiority. There are no air defences left operating in Iran that we can tell. They've damaged the ballistic missile program, they've damaged the drone program as well. The problem they've had, of course, is getting oil through the Strait of Hormuz, and that has a huge economic impact. But Donald Trump also promised that there would be regime change, that they would be different from the lunatics in Tehran that were there before, the madmen, the religious crazies, as he's described them in the past as well. And just in that Truth Social post, we see a change in tone. We heard it from Pete Hegseth when he spoke on Tuesday, but the president now is saying that the government there is much less radicalised and far more intelligent, suggesting these are people we can do business with. If I reach a deal with them, then that would be a good thing. We can deal with them going forward. They're not kind of closed off. What he hasn't delivered, of course, is the pro-USA regime that he thought he might get. What he hasn't delivered is the uprising that he thought he might get. And we could be in the position where Donald Trump in 2 weeks or so announces the end of the war. But as we've heard many times from Israel, they are not going to end the war. So we could be seeing that the United States will continue to fund Israel. They'll continue to provide weapons to Israel, but they won't be involved in direct conflict over Iran. There is a change of tone, and the change of tone is to make sure that Donald Trump can say, we have a big victory here and people should celebrate that. But we think it's not going to be tonight when he announces that, and things can change. This is Donald Trump. We've learned a lot over the last 8 years, but that's what we're expecting to hear from him in just over 11 hours' time.
Alan Fisher live for us there from the White House. Let's go back to Ali Hashem, who is in Tehran for us. Ali, the leadership's been absolutely clear. They are not going to negotiate under fire. And in the last part of this Truth Social post, he says, we will continue, if they don't meet our demands, into bombing them into the Stone Age. Those were his exact words. This does not feel like a new round of negotiations. It feels like threats. Do you think?
Well, indeed, and just few minutes ago, to the east of Tehran, it was visible to me from my side, 2 huge explosions, two airstrikes hit the eastern side of the Iranian capital. So still business as usual. Airstrikes going on, nothing has stopped. And the Iranians are aware of this situation. They're aware that they are in the middle of a very bitter war. They say it's not the war of their choice. However, they have to fight it till the end because they know this is now becoming existential for their posture in this region. Now, there's a very huge rift between them and their neighbors in the Gulf. They are in a situation, a very dire economic situation. So this has to come to an end in a way that they know it's not going to be a repeated one, and they know that they can get back to the normality of the past, not the very close past, rather the old past. So what the Iranians are now dealing with is a president in the United States coming out saying, well, they want a ceasefire, I'm going to still hit them till they are destroyed, and then I'll just see if I'm going to give them this. Now they're saying, no, this is not going to happen. We're going to continue this war till the end, until we achieve our objectives. This is what we've heard from the foreign minister and from different other officials, including the commanders in the IRGC, the ones in charge actually of the battle.
That's Ali Hashim live for us in Tehran. Let's bring in Noor Uday, who is following developments in Israel from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. This is going to lay bare the difference between Israel's strategy and the American strategy. Donald Trump simply wants this to be over, and he's almost wishing it into existence, but the Israelis are going to be surprised at the very least about this ceasefire claim.
That's right, Imran. I mean, Israel does not want a ceasefire at this moment, and that's why they tried to accelerate the kind of airstrikes, qualitative airstrikes, done over the past week or so, moving from targeting police stations and checkpoints of the Basij, for example, to more strategic targets like the steel factories, like the pharmaceutical companies that produce cancer treatment and treatment for MS and others, things that would help achieve the goal of...
Hold on a second, Chad. Trump is in court right now for that birthright citizenship. So we're going to head over to there and listen to this. Hold up.
Of allegiance. So it's from not subject to any foreign power, and then the debates just a couple months later make it very clear that they're recodifying the same conception. They were dissatisfied with the potential ambiguity in the phrase Indians not taxed, and they adopted subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And one of the strongest statements of this is Senator Trumbull's statement that I quoted at the beginning, where he says, he's asked, what does that mean, subject to the jurisdiction thereof? And he says, it means not owing allegiance to anybody else. That is what it means. And this court picked up on that in Elk against Wilkins when it says, it uses, completely subject to the political jurisdiction, not mere regulatory jurisdiction.
All right, we've been listening to U.S. Solicitor General John Sauer arguing before the U.S. Supreme Court, and recall that President Trump is in attendance at the Supreme Court oral arguments here, and we'll be dipping back into some of those arguments. Right now, we want to convene a nice roundtable to kind of put this into context.
Independently of any domiciliation, independently of the taking of any oath of allegiance or renouncing any former allegiance, it is well known that by the public law, a non-citizen, while he is here in the United States, owes obedience to this country's laws. Now, the examples that Wong R. Kim used as exceptions are situations in which there was not temporary allegiance to the United States. The children of foreign diplomats whose only allegiance was to their foreign country, and or occupied territory residents, including those citizens in Maine who had been occupied by the British forces. The U.S. had no control over them. And the whole theory of the Indian tribes was similar. The Indian tribes were analogized to foreign diplomats. So what do we do with that?
I say, too, India strongly supports us because, of course, by 1866 and 1868, there was strong understanding that the Indian tribes were subject to the United States regulatory jurisdiction.
But not the same way that temporary foreigners were, meaning there was a real debate going on whether the U.S. actually had jurisdiction over Indian tribes. That's why our cases, for the longest time, until that was finally settled, said, absent some act of Congress, our laws don't apply. U.S. laws don't apply to Indians on Indian lands, correct?
I believe you look at the Rogers decision, for example, that we cite in our brief, where they say that they are subject to the United States.
That's later. I'm talking at the time.
Yes, at the time. So as to
All right,
1817.
So what do you do during the debates of the 1866 Civil Rights Act and of the 14th Amendment with the entire discussion of the people who opposed the amendment, who kept saying, we can't pass it because we're making citizens of gypsies, allegiance to anybody, and we're never going to make citizens of Chinese people who can't be citizens because we're not going to permit them to be citizens. What do we do with those debates and the fact that the proponents of both acts said everyone who's born in the U.S. will be citizens?
First, as that particular exchange, page 2890 of the congressional record from 1866, Senator Cowan gives this virulently racist statement where he says that. And what does he say right at the beginning of that sort of offensive speech? He says, we can't have children of gypsies, children of Chinese immigrants, we can't have them become citizens. And he says, quote, have they any more rights than in the United States? So he's trying to persuade the Republicans to his view by appealing to a common understanding that sojourners do not have children who become citizens. So there's powerful evidence there that everybody understood this to, not sweep in the temporary sojourner. And that's why you see for 40, 50 years, you see every commentator who addresses the specific question of temporary presence saying it's not covered by the clause, including for decades after Wong Kim Ark.
General, can I take you back to the Chief Justice's question about the specific exceptions to birthright citizenship that everybody seems to agree were recognized under the common law? And it brings up an important principle about how we interpret the law. When particular problems pop up, lawmakers may enact a general rule. When they do that, is the application of that general rule limited only to the situations that they had in mind when they adopted the general rule, or do we say they adopted a general rule, they meant for that to apply to later applications that might come up? Justice Scalia had an example that dealt with this situation. He imagined an old theft statute that was enacted well before anybody conceived of a microwave oven, and then afterwards someone is charged with the crime of stealing a microwave oven, and this fellow says, well, I can't be convicted under this because the microwave oven didn't exist at that time. And he dismissed that. There's a general rule there, and you apply it to future applications. And what we're dealing with here is something that was basically unknown at the time when the 14th Amendment was adopted, which is illegal immigration. So how do we deal with that situation when we have a general rule?
Yeah, I strongly agree with the way that you framed it, that there is a general principle, that's a broad principle that's adopted in the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And we submit that our theory of allegiance and domicile-based allegiance is what explains those specific exceptions that everybody was aware of, but it is broad enough to sweep in future situations. And as you pointed out, illegal immigration did not exist then. Now, the problem of temporary visitors did exist. And it's very interesting that as you look at pages 26 and 28 of our brief, commentators going from 1881 until 1922 are uniformly saying the children of temporary visitors are not included. Now that logic, we say, it naturally extends. It's really an a fortiori case if you have someone who enters illegally
clause, I think, does not support you. I think you're sort of looking for some more technical, esoteric meaning. And then the question comes, okay, if the text doesn't support you, if there's a real history of people using it that way,
Sorry about that,
as far as I can
Chad.
tell, at the time of the 14th, you're using some pretty obscure sources to get to this concept.
Well, I take it straight from the framers' mouths. So, for example, Senator Trumbull was asked, what does jurisdiction mean? He means subject to the jurisdiction. He said, what does that mean? He says it means not owing allegiance to anybody else. He is the principal framer of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Representative Bigham, who's the framer of the 14th Amendment, is asked, what does it mean in the congressional record at page 1291? He says, within the jurisdiction of the United States of parents not owing allegiance to any foreign sovereignty. And we've cited many, many examples where the congressional debates reflect that. Then you referred to the oration of George Bancroft. That's one of probably 16 sources, but there's at least 13, counting that one in the 12 treatises we cite at pages 26 to 28 of our brief. There's over a dozen sources that specifically address temporary sojourners. In the 5 decades after the enactment of the amendment, every single one of them says, well, temporary sojourners, their children are not included, including for 2 decades after Wong Kim Ark.
So if domicile's the key linchpin to your argument, and I take it that it is, do we look at how domicile was understood in 1868, or do we look at it how it's understood today in context of the INA?
The 1868 understanding, I'm not aware of a strong difference between those.
Well, here's where I'm going with it. I'm just working within your argument for a moment. Today, you can point to laws against immigration that are much more restrictive than they were in 1860. We really didn't have laws like that we do today until maybe 1880. So if somebody showed up here in 1868 and established domicile, that was perfectly fine without respect to anything, any immigration laws. There they were. And so why wouldn't we, even if we were to apply your own test, come to the conclusion that the fact that someone might be illegal is immaterial?
I would first cite Wong Kim Ark on that point, because Wong Kim Ark says you're...
Well, I'm not sure how much you want to rely on Wong Kim Ark.
But there is a statement in there that says, so long as they are permitted to be here. So Wong Kim Ark, keep in mind that by the time they decide Wong Kim Ark in 1898...
but that's 1898. Now I'm looking at 1868. You're telling me is when I should look, and the test for domicile. And the stuff you have about unlawfully present, it's like Roman law sources you're going to.
First and second restatements as well, and decisions of this court.
So it wouldn't be the INA that would control whether you're capable of having domicile. It would be whatever the law was in 1868.
I think that this is addressed by my exchange with Justice Alito from earlier, which is that this concept, jurisdiction, baking in allegiance and domicile,
so Congress
is applied
could continually restrict who may lawfully be present more and more, and you would say that would be incorporated into it, even though you're telling us to apply the original meaning of 1868.
The original meaning of domicile. And so the question is there any argument that the framers intended to preclude Congress from dictating who can and who cannot establish a lawful domicile here? I don't see any evidence of that in the congressional record, so it's a natural extension.
Whose domicile matters? I mean, it's not the child, obviously. It's the parents you'd have us focus on. And, what if, is it the husband? Is it the wife? What if they're unmarried? Whose domicile?
Well, in the executive order, it draws a distinction between the mother and the father. It's really the mother's domicile. I think that would matter there.
But 1868 matters, you're telling us. So what was the answer?
The 1868 sources talk about parental. I'm not aware of them drawing a distinction between mother or father, but they say the domicile of the child follows the domicile of the parents.
And how are we going to determine domicile? I mean, would we use contemporary sources on what qualifies as domicile in a state, or do we look in 1868? And do we have to do this for every single person?
And again, I don't see a strong distinction between those because, of course, domicile is a high-level concept, has been pretty consistent over centuries, which is lawful presence with the intent to remain permanently. That domicile, when you've come to a new nation, you say, I'm here to stay, you become part of their political community, and you become akin to a citizen. And that's reflected very strongly in the case I cited before.
And just to circle back to Justice Kagan's point, it's striking that in none of the debates do we have parents discussed. We have the child's citizenship and the focus of clauses on the child, not on the parents. and you don't see domicile mentioned in the debates. That's the absence is striking.
I think the 19th century sources would say a newborn child lacks the capacity to form a domicile, so they're imputed the domicile of their parents. So I don't think they would have seen a distinction between children and parents. And I point out that their position, like ours, is forced to look at the domicile of the parents, because if you look at the exceptions that they accept, like
I'm talking about
tribal Indians and so forth.
I'm talking about in the debates over the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act. It's striking that these concepts aren't discussed in them.
I think domicile is discussed. I mean, it's brought up in many...
Allegiance, jurisdiction, complete jurisdiction.
Well, I mean, here's just a few examples. Page 1679 of the Congressional Record, President Johnson vetoes the first version of the Civil Rights Act, and he says, I can't sign this because it would extend citizenship to the children of, quote, all domiciled aliens and foreigners, even if not naturalized. And you have all the other sources we cited that say, this is a deeply rooted 19th century understanding. It's reflected in the Venus. It's reflected in the Pizarro in 1814 and 1817. It carries through the 19th century, and this court is talking about it in 1892 and 1893 when it's discussing the Chinese Exclusion Acts. Domicile is the key concept that creates allegiance. That's
General,
you said in your reply brief that the children of slaves who were brought here unlawfully, in defiance of laws forbidding the slave trade, would in fact be citizens. And we can imagine that their parents were not only brought here in violation of United States law, but were here against their will, and so maybe felt allegiance to the countries where they were from. And you say that the purpose of the 14th Amendment was to put all slaves on equal footing, newly freed slaves on equal footing, and so they would be citizens. But that's not textual. So how do you get there? You say it in just a few sentences, so can you elaborate?
Sure. If you look at I think if you look at the 19th century sources, what you see is that even though their entry may have been unlawful, 19th century antebellum law never treated their presence as unlawful. In fact, quite the opposite. One of the amici, in fact, points to like a Mississippi statute, which probably is replicated throughout the South before the Civil War, that says slaves in Mississippi have an indefeasible domicile in Mississippi. In other words, even if they run away, if they get away, Mississippi says, nope, you still live here. Right? And so it would be astonishing, in other words, for the opponents of the 14th Amendment to say, oh, these people were not domiciled and therefore it goes the other way, because actually U.S. law, even if they were brought in illegally and through an illegal slave trade, once they were there by
their intent is to return as soon as they can, let's say. So they're here, they're resident, and maybe under your theory, which says, well, lawfulness for a different purpose, but they're here, they're resident, let's take your assumption that they're not here unlawfully. But let's say they don't have an intent to stay. They want to escape and go back the second they can. Are they domiciled?
Under the 19th century law, I think this is the flip side of the hypothetical that we were talking about earlier. Under 19th century law, they are treated as domiciled in the United States, so it'd be astonishing. And in the debates in the congressional floor, talk about not this specific case, but to say, look, slaves who have been forced to come here and have been here are lawfully domiciled here. They don't use the ways domiciled, but they use allegiance. They say they don't have allegiance once they've been forced to come here, they don't have allegiance to any foreign or African potentate, and therefore
But General, that goes. How would that apply to the children of illegally trafficked people today? Would the same reasoning apply?
It would turn on whether the parents are lawfully domiciled in the United States.
So if they're brought in illegally, but then they choose to remain and they want to remain and they're domiciled, you would say that their lawful presence is not dictated by whether they were brought here lawfully or not. And that's different from someone who, say, crosses the border unlawfully.
Yeah, I think it would turn on whether their presence is lawful.
General,
in other words, obviously there may be many other important things that could be done to assist people like that. The question is, if they give birth to someone in the United States, that person naturally a citizen, that would turn, based on the original public meaning of the clause, on the lawfulness of their presence. Are they domiciled?
General, can I ask you a question? To follow up on what Justice Gorsuch was exploring with you with respect to domicile, did I understand you to say that domicile is going to be eventually or is controlled by Congress? Who is domiciled? I'm struggling to figure out who is domiciled in your argument.
The domiciliaries are people who are lawfully present and have an intent to remain permanently. So that's a kind of black letter, understanding of domicile. Now, Congress can dictate that certain classes of people, legal entrants and so forth, cannot lawfully lack the legal capacity to form a legally binding domicile.
But if that's so, then doesn't it make the domicile for the purpose of the 14th Amendment turned then ultimately on Congress's will in a way that the framers did not intend. I mean, my understanding was the framers put this citizenship clause into the Constitution to prevent future Congresses from being able to affect citizenship in this way.
Sure.
Very briefly, no, I don't think so, because it is up to the alien whether or not they want to be domiciled here. Now, there may be collateral
I thought you just said Congress can make determinations as to who counts as being domiciled here.
Yeah,
so if that's true, then it ultimately would impact, in your theory, whether or not this person can claim that they have citizenship for 14th Amendment purposes based on Congress's determination. And I just thought that's what the 14th Amendment was trying to get away from.
If I may.
Yes, please.
Very briefly, I just point you to the discussion in Professor Werman's amicus brief where he talks about this is not a new problem. Going back even to the British common law, there's a situation of people who lack a safe conduct and are passing through the king's domains without permission. And he says the best reading of the common law is they are not under the protection of the king and they're not covered by the rule of birthright citizenship.
Thank you, counsel. You mentioned in your briefing and also this morning the problem of birth tourism. Do you have any information about how common that is or how significant a problem it is?
It's a great question. No one knows for sure. There's a March 9th letter from a number of members of Congress to DHS saying, do we have any information about this? The media reports indicate estimates could be over a million or 1.5 million from the People's Republic of China alone. The congressional report that we cite in our brief talks about certain hotspots like Russian elites coming to Miami through these birth tourism companies. And I mean, here's the facts about it that I think is striking. Media reported as early as 2015 that based on Chinese media reports, there are 500 birth tourism companies in the People's Republic of China whose business is to bring people here to give birth and return to that nation.
Having said all that, you do agree that that has no impact on the legal analysis before us?
I think it's, I'd quote what Justice Scalia said in his Hamdan dissent where their interpretation has these implications that could not possibly have been approved by the 19th century framers of this amendment. I think that shows that they've made a mess. Their interpretation has made a mess of the provision.
Well, it certainly wasn't a problem in the 19th century.
No, but of course, we're in a new world now, as Justice Alito pointed out to, where 8 billion people are one plane ride away from having a child who's a U.S. citizen.
Well, it's a new world. It's the same Constitution.
It is, and as Justice Scalia said, I think in the case that Justice Alito was referring to, you've got a constitutional provision that addresses certain evils, and it should be extended to reasonably comparable evils. He said that about statutory interpretation. I think the same principle applies here, and I think we quote that in our brief.
Thank you. Justice Thomas, anything further?
General, you're getting a lot of questions about immigration, and they harken back, of course, to the citizenship, which is defined in or set out in the 14th Amendment. How much of the debates around the 14th Amendment had anything to do with immigration?
I think that the principal focus of those debates has to do really not with immigrants, but with the Indian tribes. I mean, obviously the main goal, the one pervading purpose, as this court said in the slaughterhouse cases, was to establish the citizenship of the freed slaves and their children. But they were very concerned about the problem of something that they all accepted as a given, which is that the children of tribal Indians are not within the rule of birthright citizenship. So I think that's what they focus on. We draw an analogy to that, to the issue of temporary sojourners. And then, but there are mentions of temporary sojourning multiple places in the congressional debates, and all of those quotes go in our direction.
And there was, Justice Sotomayor brought up Wong King Ark. There was no question in that case that about domicile, was there?
I disagree. The court says at the very beginning of its opinion, here are the accepted facts. These are lawfully domiciled here. When it states the question presented, it talks about domicile. When it recites the legal principle at page 693, it says domicile 3 times. And at page 705 at the end of the opinion, it says here's the single question we've decided. We've decided that Chinese immigrants with a permanent domicile and residence here fall within the rule of birthright citizenship.
Justice Alito?
Under the minimum definition of domicile, which I think existed in 1868 and continues to exist today, a person's domicile is the place where he or she intends to make a permanent home. Now, normally, you would think that a person who is subject to arrest at any time and removal could not establish a domicile. But we have an unusual situation here because our immigration laws have been ineffectively and in some instances unenthusiastically enforced by federal officials. So there are people who are subject to removal at any time if they are apprehended and they go through the proper procedures. But they have, in their minds, made a permanent home here and have established roots. And that raises a humanitarian problem. And I wonder if you could address that.
If I may, one legal and one humanitarian. The legal point is if you look at those cases, for example, Carson against Reed, Park against Barr, this court's decisions in Elkins and Toll against Marino, they talk about the legal capacity to create a domicile, excluding someone who may have the subjective intent, which otherwise would be determinative, as being excluded. On the humanitarian point, I would point out, as I said at the beginning, Justice Alito, that the United States rule of nearly unrestricted birthright citizenship is an outlier among modern nations. It's a very small minority of nations that have that rule. For example, every nation in Europe has a different rule, and the notion that they have a huge humanitarian crisis as a result of not having unrestricted birthright citizenship, I don't think is a strong argument. And I point out, obviously, for reliance-related reasons, this executive order applies only prospectively, and we ask the court to rule only prospectively.
Justice Sotomayor?
I agree with you what the European nation's rule is, but England was always different, wasn't it?
Not until 1983 it changed
That's not quite true. The Wong Kim Ark does a wonderful job of laying out the English rule. And you claim it was different, but there isn't any treatises or scholars who say it's different. English rule was always by birth. Other countries were not by birth. Let me just go to the implications of what you're asking us to do. You are asking us to overrule Wong Kim Ark? Well, Wong Kim Ark's parents were domiciled in the U.S., but they owed loyalty to China. They eventually returned to China. So they didn't have a primary allegiance to the United States. So you're not asking that. Are you asking us to overrule, then, our cases, one of which said that a child of illegal aliens was a citizen? You're asking us to overrule that.
No, first of all, we're not asking you to overrule Wong Kim Ark. We agree with the holding of Wong Kim Ark and much of the reasoning. And then as to those later cases starting in 1966, where the court makes sort of, unreasoned references to this
issue. Wait a minute, fin top you loose. The respondent unlawfully overstayed her visa and gave birth to a child here. The court, Harlan II, wrote, the child is, of course, an American citizen. That person wasn't domiciled here lawfully. So you're asking us to overrule that case?
I wouldn't say we're asking you to overrule. We think that's similar to a drive-by jurisdictional ruling where there's a simple statement that's not debated. There's no further analysis of it. There's really an assumption there. And we think that's similar to cases where the court just assumes jurisdiction without discussing it.
When we ruled in Trind that Indians could not become citizens, the government then after began to unnaturalize many Indians who had been sworn in as citizens. You asked us to concentrate only on the prospective nature of the citizen's order. But the logic of your position, if accepted, is that this president or the next president or a Congress or someone else could decide that it shouldn't be prospective. There would be nothing limiting that, according to your theory.
If, as we asked, the court confines its ruling to prospective relief only, which it did in
No, I'm
Sessions.
saying to you, yeah, that's what you're asking us for relief right now. I'm asking whether the logic of your theory would permit what happened after the court's decision in Trin, that the government could move to unnaturalize people who were born here of illegal residents.
No, we believe the court should do what it did in Sessions against Morales-Santana, where there was a ruling that would have deprived people who are already citizens of citizenship, and the court said this applies prospectively only, and we think that's the appropriate course here.
But that's not what we did in Trin.
We think that Sessions provides the proper course here, and that's what we're asking. We are not asking for any retroactive relief.
Justice Kagan?
General, I think even your brief concedes that the position you're taking now is a revisionist one with respect to a substantial part of our history. And I think that that's in large part because of Wong Kim Ark and the way people have read that case, which of course was in the late 19th century, and have read it ever since then. And what that case suggests is, I mean, there's a very clear rationale. You say, oh, it says the word domicile a bunch of times, which it does. It's a long opinion. It says a lot of things. But the rationale of the case is really quite clear. It says there was this common law tradition. It came from England. We know what it was. Everybody got citizenship by birth, except for a few discrete categories, which were the ones that the Chief Justice mentioned at the beginning. And that tradition carried over to the United States, and then what the 14th Amendment did was accept that tradition and not attempt to place any limitations on it. And so that was the clear rationale, a clear rationale that is diametrically different from your rationale. And everybody took Wong Kim Ark to say that, and to say that as a result of that, of course, birthright citizenship was the rule, and I think everybody has believed that for a long, long time. And I guess my question is this. You have a story about the reasons why we should go back to what you view as the original meaning. And given the long history of this country's understanding about birthright citizenship, what would it take, what do you think it should take to accept that story in terms of the magnitude of the evidence that we would need to see in order to accept this revisionist theory and in order to change what I think people have thought the rule was for more than a century?
Let me make 2 points in response to that, one historical and one legal. Historical point, I disagree with the way you've characterized the understanding of Wong Kim Ark, and I would point to something that's emphasized in their amici's briefs, which is in 1921, Richard Flournoy, who becomes a senior State Department official in the Roosevelt administration and pushes their theory as to temporary sojourners, writes a law review article in 1921 where he says, I think the children of temporary visitors should be citizens. But he admits that is not the understanding of Wong Kim Ark. He admits Wong Kim Ark did not hold that. And he admits that there's an array of authorities that go against him. He talks about careful and reliable, high authorities. And that's referring to the consensus that we point out in pages 26, 28 of our brief. We've got 12 treatises from 1881 to 1922 that all say, including for decades after Wong Kim Ark, that say children of temporary sojourners are not included. What happens between 1921 and the 1930s? Well, Mr. Flournoy became a senior State Department official, and he adopted that as the policy of the Roosevelt administration. So their argument is basically saying there wasn't this consensus going back to 1898. The consensus, as their own author admits, goes entirely in the opposite direction. For 50 years, right, for 50 years from the framing of the clause through the 1920s, maybe 60 years, the general understanding when it comes to what's at issue here and was not an issue in Wong Kim Ark is the children of temporary visitors do not become citizens under the clause. And then the legal point, you referred to this sort of concept of temporary local allegiance, and they rely on the Schooner Exchange, this theory that you've got temporary local allegiance. But if you actually look at page 572 of the congressional record, right at the beginning, introducing the Civil Rights Act, Senator Trumbull says, I said not subject to any foreign power. I wanted to say born in the United States, and owing allegiance to the United States, but I was aware that there's a, quote, a sort of allegiance from persons temporarily resident in the United States whom we have no right to make citizens. So Senator Trumbull says the reason I haven't adopted the language and meaning that they say should be packed into these provisions is that everybody knows that the children of temporary visitors should not be citizens.
Thank you, General.
Justice Gorsuch?
Just to follow up on that point, General, one interesting counterpoint about the understanding of Wong Kim Ark that followed with respect to temporary sojourners. And I take you've got your well-taken points. But there was, of course, John Marshall Harlan, the great dissenter, who dissented in Wong Kim Ark and later gave a bunch of lectures. And he posed the question about the sojourners. Suppose an English father and mother went down to the hot springs to get rid of the gout. And while there, they have a child, now back in England. Is that child a citizen of the United States, born of the jurisdiction thereof by mere accident of birth? And he says, under Wong Kim Ark, he is. And he continues, I was one of the minority, and of course I was wrong. Now, I'm sure that was tongue-in-cheek, but now, what do you do with that?
I'd say two things in response to that. First of all, he gave a speech, but we have 12 uncontradicted treatises that say the opposite, that is not what Wong Kim Ark means, and that's not the meaning of the clause. But also, I'd make a more fundamental point. When you're looking at Wong Kim Ark, one of the dissent has this dominant theme that like you can't be doing this because you can't make we all agree, or it's obvious that the children of temporary visitors do not become citizens. And how does the majority opinion address that? It says domicile 3 times when it recites the legal rule. It says permanent residence and domicile when it decides the holding. So the court should be bound by what it says. This is what we're deciding. And again, on page 75, it says this is the single question. Now, there's been a lot of discussion up to that point, but at the very end, they said the single question we've decided is the citizenship status of the children of Chinese immigrants with a permanent residence and domicile in the United States.
Do you think Native Americans today are birthright citizens under your test and under your friend's test?
I think so. I mean, obviously, they've been granted citizenship by statute.
Put aside the statute. Do you think they're birthright citizens?
No, I think the clear understanding that everybody agrees in the congressional debates is that the children of tribal Indians are not birthright citizens.
I understand that's what they said, but your test is the domicile of the parents, and that would be the test you'd have us apply today, right?
Yes. So if a tribal Indian, for example, gives up allegiance to...
Born today, birthright citizens.
I think so, on our test, if they're lawfully domiciled here.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I have to think that through, but that's my reaction.
I'll take the yes. That's all right. And then I just want to ask you quickly about the INA, adopted in 1940 and 1952. It uses the same term as the Citizenship Clause, and one might have a pretty good argument. I'm sure you got some arguments along just these lines that it should be understood to mean whatever it meant in 1868. But there was a lot of water over the dam between those two things, and as your brief points out, by the Roosevelt administration, there's a pretty strong jus soli move. That is to say that the thin concept of jurisdiction, power over, is enough, a broader understanding of birthright. Would there be an argument for reading that statute under its original plain meaning at the time, 1940, 1952, to perhaps a meaning?
We don't think that's the best interpretation referred to. One is, it would be very surprising if a statute that says exact constitution thereof were interpreted to mean something totally different or to ossify a then current misunderstanding of the clause. We think that the best analogy here is probably state long-arm statutes. Take a sort of non-controversial example. State long-arm statutes routinely say we're going to exercise personal jurisdiction to the extent of due process. It takes the constitutional standard and it puts it in the statute, and nobody thinks that those ossify, are limited to the precedent, this court's precedents at the time they are enacted. Everyone thinks that phrase, due process, incorporates, the developing law of due process and minimum context and so forth, including from this court. So we think that's the best analogy when you're looking at the constitutional phrase itself and you take it out of a freighted context. The natural interpretation is to say this reflects the objective meaning of the Constitution, and the objective meaning of the Constitution is its original public meaning in 1866 and 1868.
Do you see any notable counterpoints to that argument?
I'm sure there are arguments on the other side. We addressed them in their brief.
So you're really, at the end of the day, then, this is a straight-up constitutional ruling you want from this court, win, lose, or draw?
Yeah, we think that the statute and the Constitution means the same thing. If the court disagrees, obviously we'd prefer an adverse ruling if the court's going to do that on a statutory basis than a constitutional basis.
But you just disavowed that in your responses to me by saying that that's not an available option, is the way I understood it.
Yes, the court would have to disagree with our statutory position, which is that it means the same thing as the Constitution. But if the court were to do that, then the natural course would probably be to rule on statutory grounds alone. Now, we think they mean the same thing, and we've got arguments for that, including, I think, the analogy I just referenced.
Thank you.
Justice Kavanaugh?
General, how should we think about the text of the 14th Amendment, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, as distinct from the different language of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which refers, as you know, to persons not subject to any foreign power? Those texts are, on their face, different, and the history that Justice Kagan referred to might have developed quite a bit differently if the 14th Amendment's text had used the phrase that was in the Civil Rights Act.
That's an excellent point, and this court has held in multiple cases, Hurt against Hodge and General Building Contractors, has recognized that they're intended and they did mean the same thing, and that's powerfully reinforced by the congressional debates, where really what they're discussing is they said they were dissatisfied with the language in the Civil Rights Act because the phrase Indians not taxed they thought was ambiguous, and so they switched to the affirmative statement as opposed to the negative statement. The affirmative statement is subject to the jurisdiction thereof, but there's express statements in the congressional record essentially that we're doing the same thing, and that is what this court's case law has reflected.
Why didn't they say the same thing?
Again, it appears they preferred the sort of positive formulation subject to the jurisdiction thereof as opposed to not subject to any foreign power. And again, there's a deep concern and lengthy discussion of the potential ambiguity in the Civil Rights Act. You do the same thing, and I think that's very strongly reflected in those debates.
By the time of the 1940 and 1952 congressional actions, where Congress repeats subject to the jurisdiction thereof, given Juan Kim Ark, one might have expected Congress to use a different phrase if it wanted to try to disagree with Juan Kim Ark on what the scope of birthright citizenship or the scope of citizenship should be. And yet Congress repeats that same language knowing what the interpretation had been. So how are we to think about that?
I think baked into that question is an understanding, I think that was reflected in Justice Kagan's earlier question, that everybody understood that Juan Kim Ark meant that, and the history I talked about, I think, refutes that. That really there's a consensus that goes our way for decades and decades after the adoption of the amendment and after Juan Kim Ark on the specific question of the children of temporary visitors. And it's really not until, and again, in their author in 1921 is saying, hey, the other side is the consensus.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
But there's executive branch interpretations and others. And if you're in Congress in 1940 and 1952 and you want to limit the scope of Juan Kim Ark or to eliminate ambiguity, why do you repeat the same language rather than choosing something different? For example, you could use the language from the Civil Rights Act of 1866 or some similar formulation if your idea in 1940 and 1952 was to not have ambiguity or not have an overly broad scope.
I think if you look at the structure of that statute, where it's 1401A and then B through H, it says these are the people who are entitled to birthright citizenship. A is the constitutional standard, and then B through H are all the categories that Congress has superadded to that. I think the natural inference is that Congress is codifying, which it was consciously doing in 1941, pulling all the naturalization rules and immigration rules together into one statute and said, you go to one place, here's who is a birthright citizen. A, those who are guaranteed that right by the citizenship clause, and B through H are the ones that Congress has added through its naturalization power. So that inference to me says A is merely, it's not trying to change or alter the constitutional standard, it's just saying, hey, the baseline is what the Constitution says, and we codify that, and then we move on to the new categories.
Of what relevance, if any, do you think Section 5 of the 14th Amendment has here that gives Congress the power to enforce the article, the 14th Amendment, by appropriate legislation? Does that give Congress room here, or do you not think so?
I do think that a ruling in our favor would leave room for Congress. I don't think you'd have to rely on Section 5. I think that Congress has its own inherent power to grant citizenship by statute. So if the court were to rule in our favor for the classes of individuals that they say should be covered, Congress has the latitude to do that.
How much room do you think Section 5 gives, if any, and it may not be any, Congress to interpret the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof, or to define that? Is that relevant at all?
It's a great question, and I'm thinking about it for the first time. I assume it would be governed by the congruence and proportionality test from this court's case law. How that would apply here, I don't know. And I don't think it's presented, because our contention is that the statute means exactly the same thing. If anything is congruent and proportional, it's that. And I think the court held that in the United States against Georgia.
You've mentioned several times the practices of other countries, and that's obviously, as a policy matter, supports what you're arguing here, but obviously we try to interpret American law with American precedent based on American history. That's certainly what I try to do, and I think you try to do. And so why should we be thinking about, even though as a policy matter I get the point, thinking about, gee, European countries don't have this, or most other countries, many other countries in the world don't have this? Doesn't that, I guess I'm not seeing the relevance as a legal, constitutional, interpretive matter necessarily, although I understand it's a very good point as a policy matter.
Yeah, I largely agree with that, and you can view it as being raised preemptively, defensively. I'm going first, but obviously the other side in there, amici say, make it a prediction, end of the world type predictions, and our point is, it's a very small minority of countries. Almost every country, and certainly all European countries, have a different rule, and the world hasn't ended there.
The other side, last one, the other side relies heavily, of course, on Wong Kim Ark, and you disagree with their interpretation. Oftentimes, when you are dealing with a constitutional precedent like this, you might argue, we disagree with that interpretation, but if you adopt their interpretation or agree with their interpretation of that precedent, you should overrule it. And you haven't made that argument here, and I'm just giving you an opportunity to explain why you haven't.
Because we think it's totally unambiguous in Wong Kim Ark that the holding relates to domiciled aliens. And so we strongly agree with the holding. We think domicile was the touchstone, and we think that's not a coincidence for the reason I maybe speculated a little bit when I was talking to Justice Gorsuch about how the dissent raises this, and then the majority's like, we're putting domicile in there, so we know that the absurd conclusion that they say would come from this isn't there. But also, domicile as kind of the sort of relationship that creates this relationship of allegiance that makes you part of a political community if you're an alien from another country, that's deeply rooted in their understanding when they're doing it. They've talked about domicile in Yikwo against Hopkins in the 1892 and 1893 cases, and there's this deeply rooted understanding, again, that goes all the way back to the early 19th century. So we think that's a really important conception. So I mean, we disagree with some of the dicta in Wong Kim Ark that we discuss, and we think there's dicta that goes our way that the other side overlooks. And we're not asking the court to overrule dicta. We just say don't follow erroneous dicta and don't apply it to this brand new situation that was not decided in Wong Kim Ark.
Thank you.
Justice Barrett?
So General Sauer, I want to zoom out a little bit and think about jus soli and jus sanguinis. So as I understand it, at the time of the 14th Amendment, those were the two dominant approaches. Jus soli, the English common law, roughly following the soil. Jus sanguinis, roughly citizenship following the... Now, it was very generous on the soil, the English common law, and so it extended citizenship to those born there who may not have been born of parent citizens. But jus sanguinis, if parents who were citizens and had a child abroad, then that child's citizenship followed the parents. So one thing that's puzzling me about your argument when I think about the ratification of the 14th Amendment, in many ways it would have made sense for them, and you acknowledge the jus sanguinis in citing Vattel. It would have made sense in some ways for them to say, okay, we're going to follow, if they wanted to accomplish what you're saying they wanted to accomplish. You could say, well, we're going to follow jus sanguinis because we're going to make it all right on parentage. But instead, I mean, the 14th Amendment, we're talking about subject to the jurisdiction thereof, but it also says born in the United States. So you have the jus soli kind of point there, but you're saying it narrowed that point by tying it to the citizenship of the parents, at least as to soil. But I take it you're not arguing that United States citizens who have children born abroad would qualify for birthright citizenship. So it's kind of a narrower view of both the traditional jus soli rule and a narrower view of the jus sanguinis rule. So why would they have done that? And if they were going to invent an entirely new kind of citizenship, like an American brand, why wouldn't we have seen more discussion of that in the debates?
I think you do. And I say, I think the right way to conceptualize it, it is much more, it is a modified jus soli. Because even the British sources don't just say you're born here, you're a citizen. They say you're born here and you have to be under the protection of the sovereign. You have to have a relationship of allegiance. Allegiance is the word in Calvin's case.
But they don't focus on the parents. It's the child. And your approach focuses on the parents' allegiance.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's true of the 19th century
sources. It seems a little
sources,
ambiguous, and I'm going to ask your friend on the other side of that question.
Let me point out then that there are two criteria. One is birth on the soil, and the other is allegiance or allegiance. What we have is birth on the soil remains the same, right? And so they are, and that's why so much of Wong Kim Ark is actually we agree with, because they are adopting a modified British rule. They are not going the French rule, that Vattel talks about, where it's like who's the citizen. That had to be done by statute, as you pointed out, which it was in 1401. But what they've got is they say birth in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That is talked about as allegiance, allegiance, allegiance in the congressional debates. But they were clearly not incorporating the British feudal monarchical conception of allegiance where it's indefeasible. I mean, going back to the early 1700s, our nation had repudiated the notion that citizenship is indefeasible. The expatriation statutes from the late 1700s reflect that. And again, the congressional report that we cite there, this is the same group of congressmen, Republican congressmen, and they say things like the U.S. Constitution itself is proof that Blackstone's theory of allegiance was not accepted. So they accept birth on U.S. soil, but then they take the concept of allegiance and give it its Republican, democratic, American understanding. And that's very, very, I think that makes a ton of sense.
Okay, and let's talk about its applications. So, there are some, I can imagine it being messy in some applications. So what would you do with what the common law called foundlings? The thing about this is then you have to adjudicate. If you're looking at parents, and if you're looking at parents' domicile, then you have to adjudicate both residence and intent to stay. What if you don't know who the parents are?
I think there are marginal cases. That one, I think, has the benefit of being addressed in 1401F, where it talks about...
Yeah. But what about the Constitution?
Under the Constitution, I mean, look, domicile is a constitutional standard in all kinds of other situations.
Well, and it's hard.
Diversity jurisdiction, personal jurisdiction, sorry.
Well, yeah, and personal jurisdiction, 1332, diversity jurisdiction. And the thing is, it has to be litigated because it turns on intent. And the virtue of both jus soli and jus sanguinis, whichever one you pick, it's a bright line rule. How would it work? How would you adjudicate these cases? You're not going to know at the time of birth for some people whether they have the intent to stay or not, including U.S. citizens, by the way. I mean, what if you have someone who is living in Norway with their husband and family, but is still a U.S. citizen, comes home and has her child here and goes back? How do we know whether the child is a U.S. citizen because the parent didn't have an intent to stay?
I'd say make 2 points, one practical, one legal. The practical point is under the terms of this executive order, you don't have to because the executive order turns on objectively verifiable things, which is immigration status. Are you lawfully present but temporarily present, or do you have an illegal status? So those kind of taking evidence, so to speak, under subjective intent wouldn't be done. And as to the constitutional point, obviously domicile is baked into a lot of constitutional and legal concepts, and there may be situations where facts are determined, but if you look at the guidance that all the agencies did after this court in Costa said the agency could go forward and issue guidance, the guidance provides, I think, very, very clear, objective, verifiable approaches to doing this. And so as a practical matter, I don't think it's presented by this executive order.
Thank you, General.
Justice Jackson.
Good morning, General. So I guess I am looking at your position in this case, and it boils down to requiring us to do at least these two things. One is believe that the framers were not importing the common law rule and understanding of birthright citizenship. And the second is to believe that what they were doing was departing from that common law rule in the way that you suggest. That is, they were seeking to have this turn on domicile. I think you have a number of hurdles to accomplish those two things. One of which, I think, is that when we look at this court's case law, and no one, I think, has mentioned Schooner's Exchange, but it appears that that was an 1812 case in which it seems as though the court had already accepted at the time of the ratification of the 14th Amendment that the allegiance that you were talking about was the English common law rule. That, in other words, allegiance meant that you are covered by the laws of the jurisdiction, that you can rely on that jurisdiction's protection. That's what allegiance meant. Now, you're saying today, no, allegiance meant something about loyalty or that kind of idea. But if the Supreme Court had, prior to the 14th Amendment, established that allegiance meant the common law definition, I think your first hurdle is to help us understand why we would believe that when the 14th Amendment was ratified, the framers weren't just incorporating what we had previously said it meant.
Page 572 of the congressional record directly addresses this. They say the concept of temporary and local allegiance from the Schooner Exchange is what is meant by, or temporary and local jurisdiction from the Schooner Exchange is what is meant by the word jurisdiction in the 14th Amendment. Senator Trumbull says, I thought about saying owing allegiance, but again, quote, there's a sort of allegiance from persons temporarily resident in the United States whom we have no right to make citizens. So he expressly and consciously rejected reliance on Schooner.
What do we do with, I mean, that's a debate, and it's a discussion, very valid, but then we have a subsequent debate between Fessenden and Wade, where the same concept comes up, and it becomes clear, at least from Senator Wade's perspective, that that's wrong. So Fessenden, and I'm not sure whether these are senators, I apologize. Fessenden says, suppose a person is born here of parents from abroad temporarily in this country. Wade responds, the senator says a person may be born here and not be a citizen. I know that is so in one instance, in the case of the children of foreign ministers who reside near the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So it appears as though in that exchange, at least Senator Wade believed that the English common law understanding of what it means to have allegiance, to be a temporary person on the soil, was what was being adopted.
Yeah, that exchange strongly supports us. If you look at it in context, Senator Wade has introduced a version that says only birth on U.S. soil and doesn't have any allegiance or jurisdictional element to it. And so Senator Fessenden stands up and says, well, that can't be right because, obviously, what about the children of temporary visitors? It has this, it's another one of these statements that has this appeal to a background understanding that we all agree that the temporary visitors, their children do not become citizens. And then Senator Wade has to kind of backtrack and say, well, what are the children of ambassadors? And in the end, Congress does not adopt Senator Wade's proposal. So we think that to the extent you can draw an inference from that, the inference strongly supports us.
All right, well, let me just ask you about why we wouldn't see in the 14th Amendment anything about parental allegiance. Several of my colleagues have talked about the fact that your view of this turns on what the status of the parents are and not the child, as would the born in the United States view of it. Can you help us understand why we wouldn't expect to see a mention of parents in the text of this amendment?
I think it was well understood that, for example, children cannot, newborns cannot form domicile, so it follows every 19th century.
That assumes domicile is in the test, and I'm asking you, how do we know that Congress did adopt the test that you say it adopted?
Yeah, when you're looking at 19th century conceptions of allegiance, the notion that the allegiance, again, we say domicile is instantiating the concept of allegiance for aliens as opposed to citizen. All of that, the 19th century understands the newborn's domicile, its allegiance follows the allegiance of the parents, and I point out that their theory relies on parental allegiance as well, because they recognize the exceptions for, hostile invading armies, for tribal Indians, for ambassadors. Again, the child's allegiance status, even on their view, turns on the status of the parent.
What do we do with Professor Mueller's amicus brief and the historical record and the fact that even at times in this country where we understood that the parents were declared enemies of the United States, I'm talking about World War II and Japanese internment, babies born in that circumstance were given birthright citizenship. So it seems as though this concept of allegiance of the parents really wasn't driving birthright citizenship, at least at this period of our history. So are you saying this is wrong, or they shouldn't have gotten birthright citizenship?
Well, if they were domiciled here, yes, they should have. If they were temporarily present, then no. But the executive practice, we can see from the 1930s.
How does the temporary presence run with your concept of allegiance? I'm not sure I understand. So can you be clear? Are you saying that only people who are domiciled here, as you define it, can form the necessary loyalty to the United States?
It's not allegiance is not a question of subjective loyalty.
Okay.
It is something you owe. It's a reciprocal relationship between the citizen, whether they want it or not. They have that allegiance, and I think it's powerfully
on the basis of what?
Domicile. I mean, that's what it says in so many words in the Venus and the Pizarro. It says, look, if you're talking about an alien, if they're just temporarily passing through, no, they don't have allegiance. But if they've made it their permanent home, they become part of our political community, and they are analogous or akin to citizens.
All right, just quickly, because I'm mindful of the time. What do you do with Won Kim Ark's statement that birthright citizenship is applying, quote, independently of a residence with intention to continue such residence, independently of any domiciliation? I know that they use domicile, it's a fact in the case, but that's not a part of their holding. It's not what the reasoning turns on.
I believe you're quoting from page 693 of that opinion. It goes on to say not citizen, but the duty of obedience to our laws. It doesn't take the further step at that point and say, therefore, if you have temporary and local allegiance, you're a citizen. And immediately before that, you have that page 693 summary of the court's holding, where it says domicile, domicile.
Won Kim Ark incorporates a domicile requirement.
That is the holding. It's definitely clearly expressed in the holding.
All right, one final thing, perspective. You say perspective, we're supposed to do this. Don't worry about the people who are already here and who would not qualify under your rule. How does this work? Are you suggesting that when a baby is born, people have to have documents, present documents? Is this happening in the delivery room? How are we determining when or whether a newborn child is a citizen of the United States under your rule?
And I think that's directly addressed in the SSA guidance that's cited in our brief. What SSA says is there's currently a system where, for example, social security numbers are generated based on the birth certificate. They say this can still be, for the vast majority of instances, completely transparent. You will still get a...
No, not transparent. I'm just talking about the particulars, because now you say your rule turns on whether the person intended to stay in the United States. And I think Justice Barrett brought this up. So are we bringing pregnant women in for depositions? What are we doing to figure this out?
No, as I pointed out earlier, the executive order turns on lawfulness of status. So if you give birth to a baby in the hospital right now, it gets the birth certificate in the system. There's a computer system.
So there's no opportunity, there's apparently no opportunity then for the person to prove or to say that they actually intended to stay in the United States?
Absolutely not. The opposite is true. Their opportunity to dispute if they think they were wrongly denied, which would only happen in a tiny minority of cases, is directly addressed in that guidance.
After the fact.
Yes.
After their baby has been denied citizenship, then we can go through the process.
Yes. And the way that, I mean, I'm summarizing because I'm not an expert in computers, but there's a computer program that currently automatically generates a social security number. SSA says, look, a social security number, non-citizens can have them if they have work authorization, so it doesn't prove citizenship. We'll give you a social security number, provided that there's the system automatically checks the immigration status of the parents, which there are robust databases for, and then it appears no different to the vast majority of birthing parents.
Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Ms. Wong?
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, ask any American what our citizenship rule is, and they'll tell you, everyone born here is a citizen alike. That rule was enshrined in the 14th Amendment to put it out of the reach of any government official to destroy. When the government tried to strip Mr. Won Kim Ark's citizenship on largely the same grounds they raised today, this court said no. 30 years after ratification, this court held that the 14th Amendment embodies the English common law rule. Virtually everyone born on U.S. soil is subject to its jurisdiction and is a citizen. It excludes only those cloaked with a fiction of extraterritoriality because they are subject to another sovereign's jurisdiction, even when they're in the United States. A closed set of exceptions to an otherwise universal rule. My friend has now clearly said that the government is not asking you to overrule Wong Kim Ark. That is a fatal concession, because Wong Kim Ark's controlling rule of decision precludes their parental domicile requirement. The dissent understood that, and the majority tells us 6 times in the opinion that domicile is irrelevant under common law. Lynch versus Clark was already the dominant American case on citizenship, and it held that the US-born daughter of temporary visitors from Ireland who took the baby back to Ireland with them, that daughter was a US citizen. Authorities, including Lincoln's Attorney General and Kent's commentaries, embraced Lynch, and Kent specifically talked about temporary sojourners' children being US citizens. Justice Field said in 1884 that reflected the general understanding. That understanding was confirmed by Congress with its 1940 Act. The 14th Amendment's fixed, bright-line rule has contributed to the growth and thriving of our nation. It comes from text and history. It is workable, and it prevents manipulation. The executive order fails on all those counts. Swaths of American laws would be rendered senseless. Thousands of American babies will immediately lose their citizenship. And if you credit the government's theory, the citizenship of millions of Americans, past, present, and future, could be called into question. All of this tells us the government's theory is wrong. I welcome the court's questions.
There are 5 exceptions to citizenship that you do accept.
Yes, depending on how many you count, Justice Thomas, how you count them.
What is the underlying rule of law that you use to connect these 5 exceptions?
Sure. So, as I just said, all of the exceptions involve situations where that US-born child is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, because that extraterritoriality, that fiction of extraterritoriality, the interaction of another sovereign between the United States' jurisdiction and that person applies to the child as well as to the parent. Everyone else born in the United States is subject to the United States' jurisdiction. To answer Justice Barrett's question to my friend, that's what sets those exceptions apart from other US-born persons.
We've heard a lot of talk about Wong Kim Ark, and you dismiss the use of the word domicile in it. It appears in the opinion 20 different times, and including in the question presented and in the actual legal holding. And the government doesn't want it to be overruled because it's willing to rely on that particular fact in that case. Isn't it at least something to be concerned about, to say that since it's discussed 20 different times and has that significant role in the opinion, that you can just dismiss it as irrelevant?
Well, Mr. Chief Justice, I think we have to look at what the controlling rule of decision is in Wong Kim Ark. Justice Gray takes pains in the majority opinion to set out his analysis. He first starts with a premise that in construing the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause, we look to the English common law. That was the rule that applied from the colonial era on, at least for the colonists and for European immigrants. He then says, look, Chief Justice Marshall tells us in the Schooner Exchange what subject to the jurisdiction means, again looking to the English common law. Under English common law, if you are born in the dominions of the sovereign, you owe natural allegiance. And those who are present in the dominions of the sovereign owe temporary allegiance for as long as they're present. The only exceptions, again, in common law were ambassadors, people born on foreign ships, and people who were born during periods of foreign occupation. He then gets to the government's favorite page, 693, where he says, look, we have had this rule in the United States as to citizenship, at least for white Americans, from before independence. The purpose of the 14th Amendment was to embrace that universal rule of birthright citizenship, to embrace and incorporate the common law exceptions with the single additional exception of the pre-existing exception for tribal Indians that we had in the United States, which is an analogous exception, and that's the closed set of exceptions. You can't make sense of the holding in the case without looking to the controlling rule of decision, which is the common law. And I think my friend agrees that under English common law, domicile was not relevant, and the children born to temporary visitors in the territory of the sovereign were always considered birthright citizens.
Well, Ms. Wong, I mean, everything you say strikes me as, yeah, that's the way I read it too, but then what are those 20 domicile words doing there? Like, you can, take some of them and say, they were just summarizing the facts of the case, but not all of them. And why did they keep on, why did they sprinkle that in the opinion?
Well, I think, again, those were the stipulated facts in the case, and it's clear we have textual evidence in the majority opinion that they were simply saying this is an a fortiori application of that controlling rule that comes from the English common law. Justice Gray writes, again, after setting out the English common law rule and the exceptions with the single additional exception for children of members of Indian tribes, that the amendment in clear words and manifest intent includes the children born within the territory of the United States of all other persons of whatever race or color domiciled within the United States. And as was pointed out earlier, the very next part of that same paragraph, he cites to Webster talking about Thrasher's case, and he says, people who are born in this country owe allegiance independently of a residence within, foreign nationals owe allegiance independently of a residence with intention to continue such residence, independently of any domiciliation, and independently of taking any oath of allegiance, which is totally contrary to both the government's theory of dual allegiance or partial allegiance and to the theory of domiciliation.
I mean, I might agree with you if domicile had simply been sprinkled in the opinion. But in Wong Kim Ark, it's a long opinion, but it begins by saying, here's the question, and it ends by coming back to the question. And it says, here's the question, stated at the beginning of the opinion, namely, whether a child born in the United States of parents of Chinese descent who at the time of his birth are subjects of the Emperor of China, but have a permanent domicile and residence in the United States and are there carrying on business, and he states the diplomatic exception, and he says, for the reasons above stated, this court is of the opinion that the question must be answered in the affirmative. So why put domicile in? Sometimes it's hard to figure out what is the holding of the case. Here he tells us this is the holding of the case. Why put domicile in there? Well, it's just something, it's something irrelevant that he wanted to throw in. It's like, whether a child born in the United States of parents of Chinese descent.
Well, Chad, I think I'm ending right here. This is a hearing about birthright citizenship, but tonight, Donald Trump will be addressing America. Donald Trump will be addressing the nation tonight, and we will be here live reacting to it. So I think I'm ending right here, chat. Appreciate y'all for joining me. I will be back tonight to address the nation. So with that being said, I'm out.